To the debate, atheism versus Christianity. What makes more sense? Well, we'll find out in just under 2 hours. I'm delighted to welcome Alan Conradi. And colleagues and friends from the Atheist Foundation of Australia, and also to welcome to Mike Paget. Thank you both for being here tonight. I'm not going to waste any time, and in a few minutes we'll get started. But first I'll just introduce each speaker and go through the structure of the night. Firstly, just a comment on the fruitfulness and maybe purpose of tonight's debate. If all we do is listen and barrack and make grunting noises like when our speaker or our side makes a good point, maybe not much will be achieved tonight. I encourage you to engage with both sides of the argument, to let their arguments wash over you. I also challenge you to have the courage to change if you are swayed from your current thinking. I say that to Christians, and I say that to atheists. The structure of the debate tonight, each speaker will have an opportunity to speak for 15 minutes, and then another opportunity for 10 minutes, and then one more opportunity for 5 minutes. Each speaker will then get the chance to ask his opponent 3 questions. Then there will be questions from the floor. Tea and coffee will be served after the debate, and we look forward to hanging around for continuing discussions. I'd like to welcome once again Alan Conradi. Alan has a psychology degree and works as a behaviour support clinician for a charitable disability support organisation. Alan was never a religious person, but adopted the label of atheist around 2 years ago, as he found it to accurately define his position regarding religion. Alan represents the Atheist Foundation of Australia and is a committee member, charity organiser and media organiser for the Sydney Atheists. Welcome again. Mike Paget has a degree in physics, education and theology. He grew up as an atheist, but became a Christian later in life when he was convinced by the logic and evidence for the claims of Christianity. Mike loves good coffee, organic veggies and hanging with his kids. Mike Paget is going to be our first speaker tonight, so I'd like to welcome you to the stand.
I want to start by saying it's great to see you all here today. It really is. In a city which is known for its pacifism when it comes to knowledge of, discussions of really crucial topics like God, justice, truth, all those kind of things. It's fantastic to see that we have not enough seats to sit people in tonight. So it's great to have you here. I'm really pleased that we're here because we believe this is worth discussing. And my suggestion tonight is going to be simply this. Nothing sophisticated, but that there is simply no good reason to believe atheism, and there is every good reason to believe Christianity. Now, I recognise that for a large group here, that is a slightly contentious claim. And I don't anticipate that I'm going to prove it entirely in 35 minutes, but that's okay. It'll be a great place to start a discussion. Now, atheism is as much a claim to know something as is theism. I know that often atheists like to say it's not the case, but to quote, for example, the website of Sydney Atheists, for whom Alan is a committee member, we believe that religion is a natural phenomenon. This means that if an atheist is to prove his view, he has to do a lot more than just say there's no good evidence for God's existence. I think he needs to demonstrate his case, because if he does not believe that there is good evidence, if he does not believe that the evidence we have is valid or reliable, then I'd like to see Alan argue why tonight. I'd like to see more than just a reactive attack on Christianity. What I'd love to see is Alan's response to the question, what evidence is there that atheism is true? Now, I look forward to hearing that. That's a good question to ask, and I don't doubt that Alan will have some good responses. Now, I spent a lot of the past week exchanging emails with David Nichols, who's the president of the Atheist Foundation of Australia. And as I did, I discovered something really interesting. According to David, atheists only believe in scientific evidence not in anecdotes. I looked up Alan's blog and I found the same thing. The only evidence that atheists will accept for God is the outcome of comprehensive experiments on any testable claim. And I thought this is a real pity. Because, you know, Alan's a really bright guy and very articulate. I've seen him on Kerry-Ann Kennelly's morning show. And there's every chance that he's going to wipe the floor with me tonight. But here's the sad thing. If he does and tomorrow he goes back to his Atheist Society mates and tells them how well he did, they won't believe him. They'll say, "Where's the scientific evidence? Show me repeatability." The truth is that we believe almost nothing that we believe because of scientific evidence. And almost everything that atheists believe about science, as well as theists, they don't believe scientifically. We believe things because other people tell us, or because we remember experiencing them. In other words, we believe things not only on the basis of scientific evidence, but also on the basis of historical and personal evidence. Now, let me say something before I go any further. I love science. I have a passion for science. I like reading books on science, like by people like Richard Dawkins and Richard Feynman. I have a science degree in, by the way, it wasn't one degree in physics and theology and education, because that'd be a really weird degree. I have a degree in physics from New South Wales University, and I remember vividly the first time in a lab when I personally got to measure the time dilatory effects of relativistic velocity of muons created in the upper atmosphere by the impact of cosmic rays. It was awesome. Science rocks, okay? Let me be very clear. I do not in any way doubt science. I'm a big fan of the theory of evolution and all that stuff. But the truth is that science is not the basis of belief for the things which are most important for us. It's not even the basis for most of our really important decisions in life. So, for example, when my daughter, I got two daughters and a little son, Hughie's like 8 weeks old now, but when my eldest daughter, Susanna, tells me, "I love you, Daddy," I don't set up an experiment with all my neighbours' kids to see whether under similar circumstances they will repeat the same claim, right? Okay, I don't do a scientific test. That's not just sad, that's sick. Or when we consider going to war as a country, what we don't do is only look for scientific evidence for how we'll go. We look at history. We think about how other wars began and how they concluded and how they progressed as a basis for thinking about this really important decision. Do we go to war? Or when newspapers and TVs began reporting the collapse of the subprime market in the US, Australians started to reduce spending and pull their money out of mortgage funds. I'm guessing that the atheists here are no poorer than the Christians because they believed testimony. They believed in historical evidence, reporting, personal evidence. All these things are decisions which we make on the basis of testimony or other kinds of evidence than scientific evidence, because not all facts are scientific facts, and the God hypothesis is not a scientific hypothesis. Okay, it doesn't give rise to specific predictions, for example. Alan said in his blog, if an interactionalist God did exist, it should leave testable traces in the physical world. That's a commonly made assertion, but actually isn't true. And people like Richard Dawkins would agree. Dawkins said, a universe with a supernaturally intelligent creator is a very different kind of universe from one without. I think we'd all agree with that. But he said, it may not be so easy in practice to distinguish one kind of universe from the other. So I can actually imagine a universe which might look very much as if it were designed by a God, with all sorts of laws, conscious life, responsible agents, and yet not be designed by anything. Now, the atheist here would say that's this one. There is, however, a way in which we can investigate Christianity and the God hypothesis in a way which is both rational and reasonable without being recursive to dodgy scientific proof, which doesn't apply in this case. And that's by looking at history, in particular at the testimony of a long-dead group of people, the disciples of Jesus. Now, I want to say something very briefly and personal at this point. It's worth noting that this testimony, so the testimony of the Bible and the various corresponding documents, the progress of history and a bunch of other things as well, that convinced me to stop being an atheist and to become a Christian. I grew up in a thoroughly secular family with thoroughly secular parents, and I simply did not believe that there was any credible evidence for God. Just didn't believe it. I was quite happy with the notion that religion was an anachronism for the days when humans lived in caves and got married by bumping someone on the head. That the Bible was a bunch of fairy tales and that Christianity was a crutch for people who were intellectually and morally weak. That's what I believed.
Fair enough.
However, then I actually began to investigate the evidence for the claims of Jesus. And like so many people before me who set out to debunk those claims, I became convinced along the way. I found it reasonable, rational, and convincing. However, before we get to these historical claims, I want to talk about Occam's razor. I want to do it not because of Alan's sake, because Alan's a bright lad, but it's common among atheists lacking training in philosophy to argue that any testimony about God stuff is inherently unreliable because it violates Occam's razor. Now, for those of you who don't know what I'm talking about here, and I know it's probably a fair few, well, I expect it's not the atheists. I think they know exactly what I'm talking about. Occam's razor says that you must not unnecessarily multiply entities. In other words, you mustn't, for example, just invent a God, an additional entity for the sake of a convenient explanation because it's making something more complex when there could be a simpler solution. However, I want to make clear this. I believe that you can argue very reasonably and convincingly that belief in God is actually the most elegant, parsimonious, and economical explanation for the universe. Now, of course, some of you at this point will be saying, well, hold on, why does the universe need an explanation? The answer is to that, for those of you who don't have a passion arising from science, is because it exists, right? Those of us who have a passion for science is we want to explain everything. The universe is contingent, and therefore we presume it must have an explanation. The universe has a beginning. We know that from science. Again, it was 15 billion. I think now the figure's now 13.7 billion years old. Started a long time ago, and it's got a certain state that it's in now. The pursuit, for example, of a grand unified theory of everything is an example of a passionate, science-driven desire to find an explanation for the universe. Now, as I've said before, I'm a great fan of the theory of evolution. I don't believe we kind of need to look for particular interventions by a divine creator to explain the eye or bacterial flagellum, that kind of thing. But I do think it would not be unhelpful for us to have an explanation or an understanding for why the myriad physical laws and forces just so happen to be so finely tuned, as physicists have noted, and note more and more all the time, to make evolution so darn likely to produce life. People talk about this as the anthropic principle, and it's based on the fact that the probability of the universe being just the way it is, right? The probability of the universe being just this extraordinary way it is, with just everything just right for life, is so infinitesimally tiny. Now, one of the ways around this, again, I'm going to quote from Richard Dawkins as an example, is you could suggest instead that there is an infinite number of universes. That's one way you do it. So what happens is, in fact, there's not just one universe, okay, which means that the probability of this one universe would be extremely low, but there are a multitude, possibly as many as are physically possible, maybe even as many as are mathematically possible. There are some problems with that if it does come up later on. The problem, though, is this. Firstly, if the probability of one universe existing is extremely low, then the probability of many existing, simply mathematically speaking, is going to be even lower. But even worse, it's this. That the postulation of a multiverse, for example, is both completely unfounded scientifically, right? It's quantum physical speculation. It's up there with imagining that there is a great pink spaghetti monster, or Russell's teapot, to steal some of the analogies of my opponents. But perhaps more importantly, it is in itself a gross violation of Occam's razor. It's an extravagant multiplication of entities, whereas it's actually much simpler and much more elegant simply to postulate the existence of God. Cosmologists regularly talk about things outside the universe, other universes, other space-times, other sets of quantum laws outside space-time. And so there's actually no problem physically with the idea of something existing outside of our space-time. And a mind, which has no physical body, would actually make a really good candidate for something that exists outside, but let me just say, not physically outside, obviously, any physical space. Simultaneously, if I can think about something being in time, then we can logically think about something which might be outside of time. Only things inside time are chronologically causal. Time itself, though, can be caused by something outside time, something eternal, a timeless cause. In other words, God. I take it that Occam's razor actually leads us to the simplest possible explanation, which is a simple, non-physical consciousness. You know, don't think human consciousness necessarily, but simpler. As the early Christian says, God is without body, parts or passions, a simple mind. Is actually a simpler notion, for example, than just lots and lots of elementary particles or states as the undergirding final explanation of the universe, or a multitude of universes either. This notion of God as a final cause is in fact more economical and much more elegant. And here's the kicker, I think. It doesn't just explain why any universe would exist. It would help explain why this universe of all universes exists. A universe where conscious minds easily arise. A universe where there is a definite sense of direction, of progression. A universe with the kind of physical laws that we have. And here's the thing about both philosophy and physics and theology, where they all come together, which is this: any hypothesis which substantially raises the probability that the world should be as it is worth considering. And the God hypothesis, the simple God hypothesis of a God who is good and therefore would design and create a universe just like this one, actually provides a very, very good reason for thinking why the universe might end up this way. And because the universe is that way, it is the way as we find it, it makes the God hypothesis look very good indeed. Now, I say that because often when people think about the testimony about Jesus found in the Bible and elsewhere, they think this testimony is, in essence, from the ground up, unreliable because it points to God's stuff. Because it talks about things which are inherently improbable because God is such an improbable idea. Now I hope that, at least working a little bit with Occam's razor, I've inserted a little bit of doubt that is actually an appropriate way to engage with testimony about God's stuff. God may in fact be the simplest and most logical explanation, and we shouldn't be quite so hasty. Atheists will often say, theism, religion clearly arises from evolution. 20,000 religions, 3,000 gods. I've got a quote in here somewhere, but I don't know where it is, but that's okay. To this effect that it would most likely point, all this proliferation of gods to an idea that, religion is just a product of our primate ancestry when we were scared of things to go bump in the night. Here's another possibility. Another possibility is the reason that pretty much every people, at every time, in every culture throughout history, and most people in the world now, believe that there is some kind of God out there. It could just be that they're right. It could just be, to quote the X-Files, that there is in fact something out there.
Thank you, Mike. I'd now like to welcome Alan to the platform.
Good evening, everyone. I'd like to really share Mike's sentiment in saying that it is absolutely tremendous to see so many people that we can't find seats for you. Rational thinking, rational debate, that sort of stuff is such an important part of bringing the minds together, that to have so many people come to something like this is absolutely tremendous. Now tonight we debate the question of which makes more sense, atheism or Christianity. I intend to accurately define atheism and show you that the atheistic position on God is the most sensible stance to take. I'll also explain some of the ways that the Christian faith does not make sense, and I'll explain what I mean when I'm actually talking about the concept of sense. Now, it'd be really easy for us to fall into the trap of the straw man argument, which happens when you argue against a position that your opponent doesn't actually hold. If I was to argue against the beliefs of a different branch of Christianity than the specific one that Mike's involved with, say young earth creationism, Mike said that he's, he believes in the theory of evolution and in scientific tenets and things like that. If I was to say, all you Christians, you reject evolution and you reject the age of the earth, well, he'd just get up and say, well, that's not what we believe, and my whole argument would have been a waste of time. Likewise, Mike could mistakenly attribute something to atheism, something like atheism is a belief system, which would be wrong and easily shown to misrepresent my definition of atheism that I represent here tonight. But first, I'll talk about what I mean when talking about sense. Now, there's two ways that I see in which something can be shown to make sense. These are emotional sense and rational sense. An emotionally sensible proposition is one which helps to explain the world in a way that's minimally disturbing to one's emotional well-being. An example of this is life after death. It's emotionally difficult to accept that once your loved ones die, that's the end and you'll never see them again. This creates what's called cognitive dissonance, which is a state of irreconcilable psychological disharmony between the opposing concepts. In this case, the knowledge that death will occur and the wish for it not to. The idea of an afterlife is an emotionally relieving answer to the problem, which many people find solace in without truly considering the factual basis of it. Then, there's the second way that something can make sense, which is rational sense. Something can be said to be rationally sensible if it complies with pre-existing knowledge within the limits of a few basic rules. Now, these rules are testability, so it must be able to be shown in some way or another. Falsifiability, it must be possible to prove it wrong. And flexibility, it must be willing to change in light of evidence to the contrary. In the case of an afterlife, the rationally sensible position is that there's an absence of evidence for an afterlife, so to believe in it is irrational. This is based on the inability to test the existence of an afterlife, the absence of any prescribed route which could be used to prove the afterlife wrong, and the unwillingness of proponents of the afterlife to change their mind in light of evidence to the contrary to their position. Now, both of these routes describe some way that something can be shown to make sense, but something that's rationally sensible makes more sense than something that's emotionally sensible. Rational sense is grounded in the external world and can be objectively scrutinised. If something is rationally sensible, it will be able to stand up against objective criticism. Emotionally sensible propositions rely on subjective individual cognitive states and do not stand up against objective scrutiny. Now, which one makes sense depends on whether you prefer the emotionally comfortable answer or the rationally provable answer. In general, it seems that the majority of people prefer the comfortable answers, but there's a minority for who the truth is more important. Now, I find the quest for the truth to be an incredibly stimulating and rewarding venture. There's so much beauty in the natural world, from the microscopic to the cosmological, that there is simply no need to look for answers from a supernatural origin. I am an atheist. Atheism comes from the Greek root theos, meaning God, with the prefix a, meaning without. An atheist is simply a person that does not take belief in a God. I do not find there to be sufficient evidence to prove the existence of a God. Atheism is not a belief system. It is the absence of a belief system. There is no atheistic dogma or doctrine, no prescribed ideology, and no rules or directions on how an atheist should live their life. It's simply an answer to the question, do I believe in a God? To say that I don't believe in a God is different to saying that I believe there is no God. This distinction is the basis of many erroneous arguments against atheism, and it seems to be the wedge that Mike's trying to drive into my argument tonight. Now, to believe in something requires a psychological commitment to that thing, as does belief in something belief that something does not exist. Not to believe in something requires no psychological commitment to that thing. Take belief in fairies, for example. Now, belief in fairies requires evidence for the existence of fairies. Stating that fairies definitely do not exist also requires evidence. You have to show evidence of their non-existence. But as most of the people in this room tonight, I hope, believe, that fairies don't exist. Now, the position that you're taking is in light of the absence of provable evidence for the existence of a god. Of fairies, sorry. I get mistaken between the two. It is the most pragmatic approach to take, holding a commitment to this idea until the evidence is in, and that is precisely what atheistic thought is about. You wait until there's evidence to prove that a God exists before you believe it. It's very simple. It's a common misconception to ascribe to atheism various other different beliefs, like the belief in the theory of evolution or the Big Bang, or positions like naturalism, humanism, rationalism, skepticism, nihilism, and all those kind of things. But it's wrong to believe that they are basic atheistic tenets. Now, it might be true that many of the people that call themselves atheists hold on to those things, some or all of those different notions. But it is not. It is possible for an atheist to believe in none of those things and still be an atheist. Now, atheism is the default position on the existence of a God. It doesn't make sense to move away from that position without reasonable grounds for doing so. If there was sufficient evidence to prove the existence of a God, I would recant my atheism, but so far it has not been produced. Now, and then you must excuse me because the next bit's a little bit silly. As a Christian, Mike, you believe that a superhuman being, who we have no evidence for, magically created everything that exists, which we have no proof of. And the creation was perfect, which it's obviously not. Then later on, after making a few adjustments to the perfect creation through floods and genocides and baby-killing sprees, now, the magic super being realised that his perfect creation was in desperate need of a change of heart, so he sent down his son, who was actually him, to shake things up a bit and to put everyone back on track. Except that there's no evidence that he was there in the first place. He then sent himself to die to save his perfect creation from the punishment imposed upon it by himself. And being all-knowing, really should have seen coming in the first place. So that they all end up back by his side as he had originally intended. And the reason that all of this is true is because there is no evidence for there being a corpse in a tomb in the desert, and therefore the magic super being, who was his own son and father, must have flown, body and all, up to an everlasting party in the sky, which we have no reason to believe exists in the first place. Now, it's a parody, but it doesn't seem to be a sensible belief system. Now, I want to make sure that everybody in here realises that there's a difference between the humour and the actual argument behind the humour here. So I'll go through what I see as the fundamental blocks of Christianity. Now, Mike spoke about a lot of the arguments for the existence of a God, the cosmological argument, the anthropic principle, those sort of things, but didn't yet address Christianity, and that's what we're here tonight to debate, is atheism versus Christianity, not atheism versus the existence of God.
Yes.
Okay, so firstly, the Christians believe that there is an interventionist God who created everything. Also, they believe that it's possible to have a relationship with this God, usually through prayer. Thirdly, the biblical account of Jesus' life, and especially the miracle of resurrection, but also the other miracles, is proof that Jesus was the Son of God, not just a normal man. And finally, the fourth pillar of Christianity being that the Bible is the inspired Word of God. Now, I'm pretty sure that all of these propositions are basic to Christian faith and that none of them are rationally sensible. Now, not only does Christianity fail to make sense, but the Christian tradition has a history of impeding the introduction of propositions that do make sense, usually on the basis that they don't conform with the Bible or Christian faith, both of which are themselves not sensible. Now, Christianity has a long history of halting the progress of science and medicine, and at its core, it's a belief in an all-powerful, interactionalist God, a belief system which allows that when something is unknown or controversial, that the believer can ascribe it to a God. To answer fringe scientific claims with the name of God is to deny progress where science needs it the most. It might be emotionally reasonable to say, oh, well, it's really hard to push forward the envelope there, but it really does halt our progress. Now, from Newton to Galileo and Darwin, through to the modern struggles that we have with stem cell research, abortion, and science education, Christianity seems to always object on religious grounds rather than proposing a reasonable counter-argument. To counter reason with superstition doesn't make sense. Now, I think I just lost my page. Sorry about that. Now, if Christianity made sense, there wouldn't be so much ambiguity about how it should be practiced. The fact that there are so many Christian denominations, we have over 109 denominations of Christians here in Australia, shows that there is so much within the foundations of the Christian belief system that even the Christians cannot agree on. For Christianity to be shown to make sense, it must first be shown that there is some internal consistency to the faith. Now, for Mike to show that Christianity makes sense, he must first address all of the claims made by Christianity individually and show that each one makes sense. Now, I'm sure everybody realises that this would be a completely unreasonable task to ask in the 10 minutes that he's got left. So, my task for Mike is to give rationally sensible reasons to believe in the base propositions that I stated just before. One, that there's an interactionalist God that exists and created everything. Two, that a personal relationship with this God can be had. Three, that the biblical account of Jesus proves that he was the Son of God. And four, that the Bible is the divinely inspired text of the Holy Spirit. Now, if it can't be shown that such beliefs are more sensible to hold than to not hold them, then you'll be unable to show that Christianity is more sensible than atheism, and the debate will be mine.
Thank you, Alan. Mike, I'll just remind you, you've got 10 minutes.
That was great, mate. Thank you. That was a lot of fun. Not true, but fun. You threw in through a few red herrings. Atheism is not a belief system. That, you play around with rhetorical devices all you want. I mean, you believe that there isn't sufficient evidence. You say it's on the website. You believe that there's no reasonable data. There are beliefs in there, and whether or not it's a belief in God particularly, that's not by. But let's be honest, that's not really the heart of the discussion. I'm not really worried about that. Atheism certainly isn't a complete belief system. I never suggest that. It is a framework on which you might build other belief systems. It's kind of part of a belief system. And most atheists are honest about this, I'll be honest. So most of the atheists running in academic centres will say this, but that's okay. I'm not worried about that. I'm happy to let that go. Let's talk about other things. Alan has given me this challenge. With what I think, by the way, after the parody, a very fair description of the base tenets of Christianity. And I think he's right. They are the core beliefs of Christianity, and Christians around the world. And for that reason, they certainly deserve to be addressed at some level. There's no doubt about that. And I'm hoping to do that in a moment. I want to deal with a couple other things firstly, though, very, very briefly. Firstly, atheism is not actually the default position around the world. Atheists would like that to be the case. But the truth is it just isn't. You look around the globe, atheists are in a very small minority. Even in this country, 18.7% in this 2006 census said that they were of that group of no religion, which includes atheists, rationalists, humanists, people who didn't want to identify with any major group. Even here, atheists are the smallest group. And statistically, around the world, atheists are in decline. Now, admittedly, that's partly due to the breakdown of the USSR and China, those great atheist bulwarks who are actually giving up mainly to Christianity and to widespread other forms of spirituality. But atheism, just historically, is not the default position. So it's a bit rich to assume that without defending it from the very start. It appears around the world people believe for various reasons. Now, you could say that they are all irrational and emotional. And I take it that what Alan was trying to do there was, by talking about rationalism and emotionalism, was trying to slide in a subtle slur to imply that, in fact, Christians believe what they believe, and particularly that I believe what I believe, based on emotional drivers instead of rational drivers. Now, subtle though might be, or not, it simply isn't true. And here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to talk about testability, falsifiability, and flexibility. And I won't do it with all four of those propositions because Christians don't actually use each of those as a ground for their belief system. We start with Jesus. We start with the historical accounts of Jesus. That seems to be a great place to begin because we actually have an enormous amount of evidence. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk through the historical evidence for Jesus as the foundational basis for why Christians believe what they believe. And that will lead to things like, Alan's throwaway line about evidence was an absence of evidence in an afterlife, he pointed to, as one of the great flaws of Christianity. Well, like most systems, we work from the ground up. So we start somewhere, we work, we build, we make claims, so on. So when we, for example, Christians talk about social issues, when we talk about issues of importance, and he suggested that was superstition versus science, what it was, in fact, was a very well worked out logical framework based on the core principles of Christianity. And anyone who'd actually read any of the contributions which Christians have made in any of the ethical debates we've seen recently, they would know this. Anyone who'd actually read any theology. And I might ask Alan later on what were his favourite books of theology that he's read in preparing for this to actually make those claims about Christian thinking. That's a warning in advance. Let's talk about testimony for Jesus. What I'm going to do is I'm going to work through a couple of the issues that atheists most commonly raise about the reliability of the testimony. Remember, testimony, one of the many forms of reliable, factual, rational data that we have about the state of the world, about our own experience, on which to base decisions. And I'm going to start with a reaction from our very own Alan Conradi on his blog to the claim that the Christian Bible has remained essentially unchanged for 2,000 years. Now, I will give him some space. I think the claim was overstated. But he said, what? What's unchanged? This has to be one of the most ignorant sentences I've ever read from a Christian. It's so wrong, I don't know where to start. Well, as usual, Alan, we Christians will start from the evidence. And this is likely typical at this point of some atheist engagement. They speak with a confidence about things where experts in the area simply don't agree. You see, let's look at some examples. There is a growing scholarly consensus among both conservative and critical, that includes atheist scholars alike, that we should date the very latest of the New Testament books and letters before AD 80. The earliest, say the Gospel of Mark, the first letter to the Corinthians, and possibly to the Thessalonians, were written no later than the early half of 55 AD, and possibly much earlier. John A.T. Robinson, who is not on my team, so to speak, launched the Death of God movement. He dates the Gospels as early as 40 AD, or 7 years after crucifixion. Critical scholars date key creeds and statements about the resurrection of Jesus Christ to within 3 to 5 years after the resurrection itself. These Gospels appear to draw on written information and oral information from within the lifetime of eyewitnesses and contemporaries of the events. And Paul, the Apostle himself, in 1 Corinthians 15, suggests you go and look. He quotes a number of eyewitnesses of the resurrection of Jesus Christ in large groups of times. And he suggests that we go and investigate if we were the people at the time who received those documents. He says they are still alive. Go and check it out. And if you haven't checked out 1 Corinthians 15, I suggest you do. Julius Caesar wrote De Bella Gallico, which is the Gallic Wars from around 48 to 50 AD. Of the 9 or 10 good manuscripts we have, the oldest comes from 900 years after he wrote. Herodotus wrote his history around 450 BC. We have 8 manuscripts from AD 900 and a very few first century papyri. In comparison, we have at least 5,400 extant Greek fragments of the New Testament, 10,000 Latin Vulgates, 9,300 other early versions. We have 15,000 copies written in Latin or Syriac, like the Syriac Peshitta, some dated from as early as 150 AD. Of the 4 Gospels alone, there are 19,638 citations from the Church Fathers from the late 1st century on. There are 32,000 quotations from the New Testament found in writings from about leading up to about the Council of Nicaea in 300. The John Rylands manuscript, which is a section of John's Gospel, which was composed in Asia Minor, transported to Egypt, has been dated to 117 to 138 AD. The Lucan Papyrus in Paris is 20 to 30 years earlier. The Hebrew text, which is used as the basis of the Old Testament, that scholars use, called the Codex Leningradensis, comes from 1008. 1008, right? When the Dead Sea Scrolls, composed between 250 BC, were found in 1947, the differences between those documents, those Old Testament documents, and the Leningradensis found 1,000 years later were so small that the Hebrew that I still work with is just footnoted. That's how close the documents are. So reliable are these texts that there is really no scholarly doubt about their transmission through the centuries or the date of their composition. They are early and they are reliable. And anyone who knows anything about the field, be they Christian or non-Christian, agrees. I've cited some examples, but you can go and look them up after the debate if you like. But what this means is that it throws the focus back, not from the documents themselves, but right back onto the testimony of those who claim to be the eyewitnesses and contemporaries of Jesus Christ and his resurrection. And this obviously is where the debate needs to be. This obviously is where Alan's pointed us. This is where Christianity points us. And the real question is, are the testimonies to Jesus Christ, which we have, in as far as we can tell, according to the best of history that we have available to us, authentic? Are they reliable? Are these guys liars? Or are they deluded? Are they telling the truth? And there's a whole bunch of questions you need to look at here. I can't deal with it in any great extent here, but let me make a couple of points. We know of lots of people around the world who die for what they've been brainwashed to believe. We have no other example in history of a large movement of people claiming to have seen something which they didn't actually see and knew it, and went on to die for their beliefs. You see, you didn't move from being a first century Christian and sticking your hand up and saying, hey, I believe in Jesus Christ, his resurrection, and suddenly become a bishop with an Icenicia. Okay, you got killed. 11 out of the 12 first disciples were killed. We had this massive explosion for Christianity. It just erupted in that first century, and erupted on the basis, on the claims that a man had been crucified, died, and rose again. Now, for a start, there was no basis in Jewish background for the Jewish disciples of Jesus to remotely to ever suggest that there might in fact be someone who would claim to be a Messiah, die, rise again, and should be followed. They believed that anyone who was crucified should be cursed. Secondly, we had this idea that Jesus suddenly rolled down this tomb. Maybe he died, maybe he swooned, whatever, came before his followers, and said, I've come back to life, before he fell over and got caught by Peter. We have no basis for assuming in any way that these guys were fooled, that they were tricked by Jesus, and yet they went out and they died for him. We have independent witnesses for this. So we have a Roman Tacitus historian writing in the 2nd century. This, by the way, is undisputed. I've dropped out Josephus and the ones that are dodgy. I know that Christians have messed with some of this, but Tacitus is absolutely undisputed. Christ had undergone the death penalty in the reign of Tiberius by sentence of the procurator Pontius Pilate. We have stuff from the Talmud. Even Jesus' enemies accused him of being a sorcerer, of having magical powers. So H.G. Wells said, I'm not a historian, I'm not a believer, but I must confess as a historian that this penniless preacher from Nazareth is irrevocably the very centre of history. Jesus is easily the most dominant figure in all history. Thanks.
Is it getting hot in here, or is it just me?
It's hot.
I'll welcome Alan in 10 minutes.
Now, it's a little bit against the vein of this debating field to, when I describe what an atheist is, to come back and say, well, this person or that person or whatever says it's not. Now, the thing about being, an open-minded, free-thinking person is that we can all make up our own minds. Now, I think that if you got 20 atheists together and asked them, what is atheism to you, they're all going to come up with a completely different answer. Which is why I'm making pains to describe atheism at its base level, which is that atheism is not a belief system, but the absence of a belief system.
Yes. Right. Exactly right.
So, saying that, the Sydney Atheists use the word believe on their website, okay, we use the word believe on the website. But that doesn't, do you want it to be a misrepresentation? Or, we're just saying on there that we don't believe that there's, a God. That's not saying that we believe there is not a God. There's a big difference between the two there. Now, atheism is simply the pragmatic non-acceptance of a belief in a God on the grounds that there is insufficient evidence to prove the existence of any God. It makes no claims. It only addresses a single point in a completely sensible way. It's a very small, all-encompassing package. Give us evidence of God, and atheism will be no more. There'll be absolutely no reason for it, because there's nothing outside of that belief in God thing. Unless you continue to reject my definition of what atheism is, or to misrepresent the nature of atheism, then you really have to conclude that atheism makes sense on the grounds that I've explained.
Of course. Yes. Okay,
so in response to my request for a sensible belief, reason to believe in those basic four assumptions, okay, you went through the historicity of the Bible and those sort of things. Now, I'd just like to sort of go through those arguments and explain why it is that I think it's more sensible to withhold judgment and therefore not to state belief in those propositions. Now, on the question of whether there's an interactionalist God who creates all that exists, now, I don't really feel that was kind of answered, but perhaps in the first section you were saying that, this anthropic principle kind of thing, or the universe is so perfectly designed that it seems that it's been designed just for us, which, to take a phrase from Dawkins, is exactly what a puddle would say about a hole in the ground. The puddle's sitting there and, little bits come out to this side and little bits come out to that side, and the puddle's going, wow, this pothole is perfectly suited for me. This pothole is my pothole. Now, the reason that the universe seems perfectly suited to us is because we're just lucky enough to be here.
Yes.
There's nothing so special about the universe for us to think that it is absolutely perfect. Just look at the sheer size of the universe, and the fact that we still haven't found any other life outside of this small little blue dot that we live on. It could be out there, but from what we've seen so far, there's a hell of a lot of wasted space. And for an all-knowing, powerful God that created it all, he seems to have just not really used what he had, as well as he could. Now, I asked if it's rationally sensible to believe that the God of Christianity exists. Now, to adequately answer that question, first of all, you have to describe the God. You have to show incontrovertible evidence for its existence, and you have to be able to show that it's more sensible to believe in it than it is to not. Now, to say that everything in the universe was created by God through a top-down process raises so many more questions than it answers, and through that it really does violate Occam's razor, which you were so fondly speaking about before. Now, Occam's razor isn't based on the easiest answer is the best. It's based on the answer to a question that raises the fewest new assumptions is the one that should be taken above the others. Now, just to sort of plonk God, to the answer to life, the universe, and everything, it raises the fewest new letters, but doesn't raise. There's so much that once you say that God's there, there's so many questions raised. Who created this creator? Where did he come from? We're going to have to answer that one. How did this creator create all this stuff? Science one day might be able to show us, if this God exists. How did he do that? That's some really cool stuff he's got. And as I was saying before, it really, really seems that he didn't use his space optimally in the universe. Now, when it comes to creation of the universe, the Big Bang Theory does seem to be the most reasonable answer to the origin of the universe. It's the explanation that's most consistent with current scientific knowledge. Furthermore, if the theory is contested, the most rational answer will prevail. It might make emotional sense to fill in the gap of knowledge with the answer of God, but this would be an argument from ignorance. I don't know how it happened, therefore God must have known. Now, it doesn't make rational sense as there's no objective basis on which the claims can be shown to represent reality. Now, perhaps the most important tenet of Christianity is that Christ was God incarnate. And you were talking about the gospel authors and that they were there, they saw the guy, they saw all the miracles happen and everything. And you said that, are they liars or are they deluded? And I'd say that they're neither liars or deluded. And they've just been misinterpreted. Now, the biblical accounts of Jesus' life and miracles are what is used to prove, through Christianity that he's the Son of God, not just a regular man that did some pretty cool stuff. Now, okay, you use the Bible to prove that the character in the Bible was true, which is kind of like using, Batman comics to prove the existence of Batman. It is a weak argument. Sure, you mentioned Tacitus and some of the other non-biblical scholars there, but the lack of contemporary accounts for Jesus' life outside the Bible seems that he was more likely an amalgamation of popular archetypical legends and myths. From the Immaculate Conception to Jesus' resurrection, it has all been preceded by pagan religions. Now, I'll just go through a few of those. Now, there's Osiris, who's an Egyptian god from around 2500 BC. He had 3 wise men attending his birth on the 25th of December. His flesh is eaten as communion, as the Catholics do. And he was resurrected after death, and through him you could get to heaven. Dionysus, a Greek god from around 600 BC, was born of a virgin in a stable on the 25th of December. He performed miracles, including turning water into wine, which, the guys back then thought was pretty cool, and I'd like to see it now too. He was executed for saying that he was the Son of God, and 3 days later rose, and again, communion taken in his name. Mithra, a Persian god, was born of a virgin on the 25th of December. Ate a Last Supper with 12 disciples, died and was resurrected, and is depicted with a halo, and in a lot of the early artistic representations, it's very hard to distinguish between Mithra and Jesus. And again, communion taken in his name. Now, Attis, a Frisian god, was born of a virgin on the 25th of December. He was crucified and he resurrected. And again, communion taken in his name. And the list goes on and on and on. Now, what we see here are a set of attributions that were routinely expected of the ancient gods, being reused over and over again. There's nothing so special about the life of Jesus to assume that he is different and above the ancient gods. Now, Mike, I would say that if you were born a couple of thousand years ago, you would ascribe the same miraculous attributions that you do to Jesus to one of many gods that existed at those times. To say that Jesus is special does not make sense.
Thanks, Alan. Mike, I invite you up for your last 5-minute thing. And just to say, if someone was to give me about $100 billion, I wouldn't swap places with you right now.
That was great, Alan. I'm going to start from the end and go forward. There is a massive history of religion school, which obviously has a vested interest in discrediting Jesus as the claimed Son of God. And certainly, some of those examples you showed were really good. I'm trying to get my clock to actually go so I know where my time is up to. Some of the examples you gave were really interesting. You talked about, for example, all the resurrection cases, except they weren't resurrection, they were apotheosis, which is entirely different. The Greek religion actually didn't believe in any of its stages there was anything good about the body, and the body could be divinized, and so it was always the escape of a spirit into heaven. The idea that actually Jesus was bodily resurrection was completely new to both Jewish religion and new to the whole Greek story as well. At the 25th December start, that's really nice. Of course, it was actually a pagan festival which Christians adopted. Christians never claimed that Jesus was in fact born on the 25th of December. They just adopted festivals around the time, so that's really nice. Communion. Well, there were all these, so there were feasts, mystery feasts, all sorts of stuff. But there wasn't a eating of the body and a drinking of the blood in a metaphorical sense. It was always physical. I could go on and on. The virgin myth, some of them being misattributed, obviously. I can't go through all, but yeah, sure. It's possible that people really like the idea of a virgin birth. I get that. It kind of sounds neat, and it's a logical way, I guess. It's a logical way in a religion for God to enter the world, I guess. Logical. Well, that's funny. Maybe that's just why God did it, because that's a logical way for God to come into the world and be both human and God. Now, you suggested that somehow by pointing to the Gospels, I was actually pointing to something like Batman comics in order to justify it. Well, that's a nice story. Except no historian has ever actually compared the two and suggested they were similar. All the historians in the field suggest that, in fact, the evidence that the Gospels provide is that they're written as historical testimony. They're written as historical testimony. There are 4 of them. There's external corroboration to the data contained within it. So it's a nice, again, a rhetorical device, a good swing from the atheist camp with a very, very big bat. But it's kind of a rubber bat because it doesn't actually contain the weight that it looks like it does, because no one actually suggests that Batman is anything like the Bible who works in the field. And no one has ever actually read the Gospels through and actually compared the kind of data that it seeks to present in a way in which it seeks to present, suggests that they read like Batman, unless, of course, you approach it prejudicially from the very start. If, for example, the Gospels weren't purporting to talk about Jesus, the Son of God, no atheist would ever blink at them and suggest for a moment that they weren't historical from top to bottom, because they bear all the hallmarks of historical data. Anyway, let's talk about creation very briefly. Creation for the top-down process adds lots of questions. You had one. Who created the Creator? Well, if God is outside of space, if he's non-physical, then he doesn't require a timely causal manner. And causality and physicality and time are all bound up together. No Christians ever suggest anyone created the Creator. Well, what a silly notion. And you'd know that if you'd read stuff about it. And you know that. I'm taking that as a straw man you set up there just for me to waste some time on. Let me therefore talk about some consistency. Let's talk about consistency. Any hypothesis of God actually has to be consistent with our experience of the world. Our experience of truth and justice and beauty, our expectations for spirituality, hope, joy, our sense of guilt and shame, all that kind of thing. But I'd like to focus on 2 things: our experience of evil and our experience of spirituality. In 2005, a long-time sex offender called Joseph Duncan kidnapped Dylan, 9 years old, and his 8-year-old sister Shasta after killing Dylan's mother, older brother and mother's fiancé. He raped, tortured and threatened them before shooting Dylan, a 9-year-old boy, in the head and burning the body. And this is a problem for atheists.
What?
Let me suggest why it's a problem for atheists. It's not because atheists are bad people. I know lots of atheists who are lovely, lovely people. That's not what I'm suggesting. It suggests this. Here's the problem. All of us know deep down that this was an evil act. And it would be evil whether we've evolved slower or faster and developed a different set of attributes. And we can't say that we think it's evil just because we have a nice social construct, maybe social exchange theory, which is the basis by which we do our ethics in the society, as if a different ethical system might declare it not to be evil. We know that it's evil because it's evil. We know this, we sense this, we have a deep down sense, a broader sense of the word sense, not just irrational or emotional, but something more. We sense that there is something deeply evil about this, and every one of us thinks this is evil. And here's the problem. Atheism is inconsistent with our clear experience, as it has no basis for even talking about absolutes like evil. Evil is just a word for atheists. Secondly, there is an almost universal experience of spirituality. Most people, in most places, through most of history, have a deep sense that there is something out there. There is something more. And it's not even because of evolution or tradition, because we know that places like China and USSR, which have tried to concrete over spirituality, have seen the concrete crack and stuff erupt back up. And it's not modernism, right? Modernism has been swept away by postmodernism because most people believe in spirituality. And unless you're going to say most people are idiots or just dwelling in emotional comfort, then you have to deal with the fact that spirituality is one of the most powerful senses through most of Christianity. And if it's just evolutionary, how is it that atheists have escaped the binds of evolution so cleverly while the rest of us are still trapped? So, Christianity makes sense. It makes sense because it's the simplest answer. It makes sense because of the historical data. It makes sense because it's consistent with our experiences of the world. Christianity makes more sense.
Thanks very much, Mike. Alan, your last 5 minutes.
All right. Now, the topic of this debate has been which makes more sense. And finally, Mike got around to hitting that one on the head. Okay, I accept that Christianity might make some sense through the emotional definition of sense that I gave. And, you were saying, there's this emotional sense, there's the rational sense, and then there's this spiritual sense. Well, I would just collapse spiritual sense into emotional sense. There's no need to sort of get out there with that one. But it is the rational sense which makes more sense. And atheism, being based on rational sense, is more sensible. Now, there were some pretty big things thrown up just then. That little story about that obviously evil guy, and saying that that's a problem to atheists because atheists have no way of explaining evil. That was wrong. What that person did was wrong, and you mentioned the social exchange theory, and social exchange theory pretty much covers why that was wrong. You don't go around and do such heinous acts, because that's going to lead to your downfall. You're not going to survive if you keep doing those things. In these days we don't have the death penalty, so you might survive to pass on your genes or whatever. But looking back in an evolutionary model, somebody that murdered children and families and all those heinous things, it probably would have got killed by their community and not moved on. That's how social exchange works. Now, a couple of the other things that you were talking about, I think in your opening statements, you spoke about that love is something that can't be proven. Therefore, this scientific, evidence-based system, can't handle everything that's thrown at it. But I'd challenge that, and I'd say that you can prove love through evidence. When you say that you love somebody, or when somebody says that they love you, you're not going to take that on face value. If somebody just comes up to you on the street on a Friday night and goes, "I love you," there's not really going to be any evidence there that that's sincere. Whereas your partner that you've been with for 7 long years, turns to you in the morning, dreamy eyes, looks at you, longingly and says, "I really love you." Then all of those little exchanges, all of the little body language, all of the amount of time that you've spent with each other, it's all evidence. It's not scientific evidence. It is anecdotal evidence, but it does constitute evidence. Okay, you put up that atheism has escaped the bounds of evolution. Well, atheism throughout history has always been a non-belief in a God. And the reason that it hasn't evolved is because there hasn't been evidence for the existence of a God. Now, it's not our fault that you guys haven't come up with the goods. I've shown that atheism is simply a statement of non-belief, and I really tried to hammer that one home because it's one of the major myths that goes against atheism. And that atheism is a rationally sensible position to take. I've also explained the major misunderstandings around atheism other than that, that are used in destroying the false arguments against atheism. There's a lot of these things out there, and I really try to do my best to get rid of those when we're talking about these things. Furthermore, I've outlined the major basis of the Christian faith and tried to explain how some of them fail to make sense. Now, as I see it, the major tenet of Christianity is this principle of faith. Right? It's the Christian faith. Now, the dictionary definition of the word faith is a firm belief, especially without logical proof. Now, it's fine with me if an educated adult wishes to believe something on the basis of faith, provided that they don't do any harm in its name. But they must accept that faith itself does not make sense by definition. Christianity is a faith-based belief system which does not make sense. Atheism is quite sensibly based on a lack of objectively verifiable evidence for the existence of any God. If the evidence were produced, atheism would accept defeat and move on. In the light of contradictory evidence, Christianity digs in its heels and stubbornly denies change. Atheism makes more sense than Christianity.
Yes, yes.